Zdrasti, Dober den, Kazvam se, Joseph Kursky. How to learn about different countries with interactive web maps created with the Geographic Information System. One of the first things I use, one of the first tools that I use, is the 3D scene viewer from ArcGIS.com from Esri, Environmental Systems Research Institute. In that 3D scene viewer, as you can see, I can tilt and pan, I can change the base map. So let's say I want to learn about Bulgaria, for example. I can look at the terrain at different scales. I can look at imagery. I can change the base map to a variety of things just at the touch of the button without signing into anything, just with a web browser. In that scenario, let's change it to imagery now and look at some towns in Bulgaria, looking at the urban forms, looking at the landforms, the way the city is laid out, the terrain, the land use, crops, agriculture. Let's take a look at the coast for a bit. Ooh, I can see some human and cultural geography influences here. I can see coastal processes, so formation of beaches, sand spits, tombolos, and other formations. I can also see how people have settled the landscape here, so I can change it to streets and other themes, as I mentioned before, at different scales. I love this human geography base map and also the modern antique base map. And the colored pencil and the mid-century. I love them all. What's not to love? Experiment with these. Again, it's the 3D scene viewer. Go to ArcGIS.com and say, create a new scene, and you can do exactly what I'm doing here again without any sign-in. With signing in, you get more power. You can add things, you can save maps, etc. That's a topic of other videos. But just right here, let's just explore and look at the transparency tools and so on. You've also got a measure tool here, so you can measure the distance between coastal villages and so on, the perimeter of lakes, the area of lakes, and other formations such as mountains. Okay. That is the 3D scene viewer. I think it's a great way of exploring countries. And for that matter, regions, cities. Let's take a look at ecoregions now. Ecoregions and biomes. I'm now in ArcGIS.com. And again, notice in the upper right, I'm not signed into anything. I simply said modify map, and then I use the add button to add a few layers. For example, annual precipitation, WWF priority ecoregions of the world. And I'm clicking on different areas so you can see the different ecoregion attributes there. Now I'm looking at total annual precipitation. It's important to know what the units are. So in this case, millimeters. I can see the different variation across Bulgaria and indeed the whole Southeast Europe region and how it varies. And so I can look at how mountains and coasts and other factors, latitude, altitude, influence the precipitation. Now I'm looking at priority ecoregions for various reasons by the WWF and why they are priority ecoregions, so I can explore some environmental issues in Bulgaria and elsewhere, but using Bulgaria as an example. Another layer that I have in here is anthropomorphic ecoregions, so looking at land cover and how it is influenced by people and how people influence land cover. Now I'm looking at the Living Atlas of the World Water Balance app, also from Esri. I can look at the Amazon rainforest and see the variation, not winter and summer, but looking at wet season versus dry season. Then I can zoom into my country of analysis, in this case Bulgaria, and look at how the precipitation or the soil moisture or any other of the 6 variables that are listed in this water balance app vary over space, so across different regions of the country and over time. And you can see several times over the last few years, the rainfall has markedly increased. Very interesting here in this area. Now we can also look at snowpack, and of course, we've got an elevation influence there. So I'm looking at the mountains in especially southwest Bulgaria being packed with snow for parts of the year, but then I can see the variation and looking at the north and the northeast sections of the country where there is no snowpack. According to this data set. We always have to say according to this data set. Now here is part of the coolmaps.esri.com gallery, coolmaps.esri.com. I can look at inbound and outbound migration over time, so 1990 to 2013, according to the UN data, and you can look at the metadata behind the map to find out who created it, why it was created, the dates, and so on. I can also look at this not just in the 3D mode, but in 2D mode, so I can see how inbound and outbound migration has changed over time, and who sends people to Bulgaria, where do people in Bulgaria migrate to, and so on. So this gives me another sense, another dynamic sense of what's going on in that country. And then, of course, what we want to do when we look at dynamic maps and ask these questions is think about what's where, why is it there, and why should we care? Why should we care about rainfall and land cover and coastal processes and urbanization and so on? Why should we care about that? Why should we care about migration? Why should we care about climate and ecoregions? So it's all part of that whole geographic inquiry discussion. Another tool that I like to use is the Wayback imagery, and we have a new swipe tool in there, so I can look at the whole country, but I can also zoom into different cities, and I can see right here that there have been some construction projects over the last few years. This imagery goes back about 6 years, so I can see right here that between 2014 and 2020 there are a number of housing projects that have been built and some industry as well, and I can see some of the land cover changes also. It looks like there's some area in the south part of this particular image, as I'm zooming in right here, where it was constructed between 2018 and 2020. So that's the Wayback imagery. You can look at anywhere in the world. You can look at glaciers, desert landforms, volcanism, coastal processes, and much more. Here is a coastal area in Bulgaria, and you can see that with the construction of these jetties, it held back, this is a typical coastal process, it holds back the sand from migrating down the coast, and so you can see a lot bigger of a beach, which is probably part of the reason why that was constructed. Part of the beach was created because of those jetties that were constructed. How did I find that data? Well, one of the sources is the Living Atlas of the World. So I can search on Bulgaria, as you can see here, and figure out where some of these layers could come from. So in ArcGIS Online, I can go to Map, and I can add a couple of layers of interest. Using the Modify Map and then Add Search for Layers, I can search in ArcGIS Online. I can also search in the Living Atlas of the World. Now I'm going to look at Bulgaria purchasing power to see if there's any variation between different districts, municipalities, regions in Bulgaria. And again, thinking about why those regions might have different purchasing power. Again, know your data, understand what purchasing power is, but I can change the base map to terrain with labels so I can see some of the cultural features below, i.e. the cities and highways and so on. And now I can see the variation with this sort of red to aqua color, red being low on purchasing power according to this data set, and aqua being higher in the purchasing power. And I can see the variation there. As expected, right around the capital of Sofia, I have a higher purchasing power, and then in other areas, it's a bit lower. Also in the coast, I've got some higher purchasing power there. I'm also going to look at household size. Again, what's where, why is it there, and why should we care? There's different household size based on internal migration, external migration, immigration, and so on. I can look at the influence of employment, or family size, or cities, or rural areas, occupation, and so on. And I can see the variation of average household size around the country. Of course, I can do this for other countries as well. It's just fascinating to be able to look at these patterns and then think about, again, why do these patterns exist, and who cares about purchasing power or people per household? Well, people that in planning. Again, this is why GIS, Geographic Information Systems, were created in the first place, so people can use these tools to plan more resilient cities, more sustainable areas, and so on. I also like to look at hazards that confront different countries of various kinds: hurricanes, tornadoes, typhoons, in this case, earthquakes. I can look at Bulgaria and I can see that the closest earthquakes over the last 30 days, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, were over in Macedonia, and also in the Aegean Sea. There's a couple in Turkey. There's a plate boundary that runs close to Bulgaria to the south, so that it makes sense that these earthquakes are more along or near the plate boundaries. Fortunately, over the last 30 days, there hasn't been any, according to this data set, but I can measure, for example, in kilometers, how close the closest ones have been, 100 and some odd kilometers, 310 kilometers to this one over in the Aegean Sea. So I like to look at hazards. It's another way of understanding a country. I also also look at Google Maps and Street View to get a sample of the cultural influence on the landscape, the languages, the architecture, the land use, the housing type, and so on and so forth. So just looking at Street View for Bulgaria, here's a typical rural scene. What are these houses made of? What kind of fences are there? Here's a more of a mountainous scene. What side of the road do they drive on? All kinds of interesting things that you can look at. The vegetation types, what kind of mode people are transporting themselves on. Here's a beautiful coastal village along the Black Sea, so I can look at coastal erosion and coastal processes. Also, Esri, Bulgaria, our colleagues out there, they've got a whole wealth of things, including a photo contest for favorite places in Bulgaria. That's going to be fascinating to look at when that contest is done. Storymaps.arcgis.com, multimedia maps that you can explore, and also you or your students could make these things. So there's a couple of story maps that I thought would be of interest. I always look at story maps to see if there's any story maps created for a country that I'm interested in, and this is a very nice sort of photo tour of Bulgaria, sampling of places. Oh, this is fascinating. Look at this. Cultural and physical landforms and things on the landscape. So that's one of the story maps that I wanted to show. Another one here shows the story of a musician over her lifetime and her story and her journey. So story maps can be very personal, and I encourage you to explore story maps if you have not already used them or created them. That's another one I wanted to show you. The last one is this wonderful story map on Bulgarian folk costumes, and what people wear and have worn over the decades, over the centuries. It's just fascinating. And look at some of these beautiful clothing pieces that these folks are wearing here. And you can investigate more about how those all came to be with this story map. Another tool which I love is the profile tool. You can measure, for example, depth in the Black Sea. It also works on land, of course. So if I measure across Bulgaria or any other country, I can get an elevation profile. So this is a nice integration of math, because you have to look at the vertical and the horizontal distance and know what the units you're using, and geography and looking at landforms and landscapes. So it's the elevation profile tool. Let's summarize. Looking at countries according to interactive web maps, all created with GIS, Geographic Information Systems. Most of the ones that I showed here are made with ArcGIS.com or ArcGIS Online and web mapping application derivatives such as story maps. I invite you to pursue those in your own teaching, in your own learning, and it is a great way of understanding countries, hazards, population, and so on. Thanks.